Where were the continents 500 million years ago? How did life conquer the land? 500 million years ago, our planet was unrecognizable. The continents, gathered in the southern hemisphere, formed a massive arid landmass, the supercontinent Gondwana. The oceans were already teeming with life, but on land, there were no plants, no trees, no insects. A mineral world, hostile, swept by fierce winds and bombarded by the sun's ultraviolet rays. Yet, it was during this time that one of life's greatest adventures unfolded, the conquest of the continents. But before embarking on a new adventure, think about liking the video and subscribing to the channel to not miss anything. Thank you and bon voyage. The modern continents do not exist yet. Here, the air is unbreathable for us, rich in carbon dioxide and low in the vital oxygen we are accustomed to. Unlike today, where our planet is synonymous with a haven of peace, possibly the only one in the entire universe, 500 million years ago, Earth was truly hostile to many living organisms of our time. Our planet is still very young, primitive. It is not ready to become the host of the rich and diverse life it will know in the future. It prepares as best it can, but there is still a long way to go. It is this path that will become our journey. Let's start with the Cambrian if you are ready for the adventure. This period is a key to evolution, with the emergence of many complex forms of life in the oceans. Let's dive into the mysterious waters where life bubbles. On the surface, we are far from the vegetal richness of the modern world, but in the oceans, life seems perfectly settled and quite at ease. It must be said that the foundations of life were laid a few million years earlier. In the Precambrian, in a previous journey, we saw how life had largely met the challenge of evolution. Initially, a simple bacterium, billions of years later, the living world metamorphoses. The first living organisms develop and acquire new abilities, new forms, and new characteristics. These unprecedented abilities promote the development and enrichment of marine fauna and flora. We're talking about a real diversification of species here. This includes algae such as red algae, as well as sponges and very different species such as Charnia, Dickinsonia, Trabechidium, Charniodiscus, Sprigina, or Claudina, our first reef builders. Since then, the marine world has never stopped evolving. The end of the Proterozoic, and more specifically, the end of the Precambrian, allows us to glimpse many possibilities for aquatic life. It must be said that the famous first reefs, which we left barely 600 million years, or 373 million years ago, were promising, constituting real shelters for future marine organisms. In this enchanting setting, where the beginnings of marine life reside, we quickly find the emblematic animal of the period, the trilobite. You will hear about it for many years. It has perfectly adapted to the peculiar conditions of the oceans at the time. Let's see if one of them is hiding nearby. Studying them in their natural habitat would allow us to better understand these small marine creatures. Ah, just here, trilobites. Do you see them? These little creatures with segmented bodies. They crawl on the seabed and resemble ancestors of modern insects and crustaceans. Trilobites are marine arthropods, meaning they have a spine and 2 lateral lobes. Disappearing about 250 million years ago, they had their moment of glory and became iconic beings of the Paleozoic. From the Cambrian to the Permian, there wasn't a period without their abundant and flourishing presence in the oceans. They occupied all corners of the globe and diversified greatly throughout their incredible evolution. All trilobites have a common morphology, namely a head, a thorax, and a pygidium, or tail. With diversification, different species of trilobites adopt characteristics unique to each. You can see some with specific outgrowths, different colors, or with a more pointed or rounded shape. For others, it will be an opportunity to show extreme sizes. If the smallest of them must not measure more than 1 millimeter or 0.039 inches, others are close to 70 centimeters or 28 inches long. By observing its gait a little, you can probably guess its lifestyle and diet. It is indeed a benthic animal. It roams back and forth across the ocean floor. Depending on the period in which we observe these small marine beings, they don't eat exactly the same thing. Our oldest trilobites, like the olenoids for example, love aquatic worms. This otoya should provide enough nourishment for it. This little worm, about 15 centimeters or 6 inches long, is one of the oldest known preapulid worms. It's a rather effective predator in its category. It burrows into the ground in a U-shaped tunnel crafted by itself, and only sticks its head out when its meal is within its mouth's reach. The trilobite has adapted traits that allow it to thrive in its environment. Notably, its thorax is made of segments for movement across marine floors, but also its eyes, composed of facets, offering a 360 degrees vision, handy for spotting approaching predators. To protect itself from them, nature has also endowed it with a sturdy exoskeleton, a kind of armor or rigid shell that makes it harder for even the bravest marine hunters. Very abundant during most of the Paleozoic, many trilobite fossils have been found and studied by scientists over the past 200 years. While we have learned a lot about it through these researches, it hasn't revealed all its secrets even today. The species Triarthris etoni, for example, made headlines quite recently, during the year 2024. An ultra-conserved fossil site has shed light on some morphological details of the species. It is always very difficult to obtain traces from the past that are almost intact. Time inevitably causes physical damage. However, sometimes natural disasters help us preserve some testimonies from the past. Pompeii with Vesuvius, for example, where the incredible eruption, as tragic as it was for the inhabitants, managed to preserve elements from the past. Volcanoes associated with the movements of tectonic plates can experience very large-scale eruptions that are capable of trapping life almost instantly. This was also the case in Morocco millions of years ago, in the Souss-Massa region at Ait Youb. A volcano was in some way the Vesuvius for our trilobite. When the volcano erupted, the heat melted all organic matter nearby. However, the solidified ashes became a kind of mold that perfectly matched the elements. This is how scientists could analyze the tiniest details of our Triarthris etoni. It was long believed that it had 3 pairs of cephalic legs. Finally, it has 4. You can also clearly see the different segments associated with the eyes, antennas, and its famous legs. Thanks to current technology, scientists have even been able to work on computers to define a trilobite in 3 dimensions. Never have the details of its anatomy been so precise and precious for research. Let's continue our marine journey into the Cambrian seas. They harbor an infinite wealth of all kinds of organisms. In fact, here is one of these most precious treasures, a calcareous sponge. These reef builders, we call them archaeocyathids. They are calcified fossils without spicules that are found exclusively in this era, the Cambrian. These first metazoans are marine architects. They take on various shapes and colors in the form of tubes, vases, strata, or even balls. Right here, you can see a small sample of the most beautiful archaeocyathes, Paranachiathus grandis, Tumuliolinthus musatovi, Orbitziathus mongolicus, Françoisiaceathus novus, and Cosinopticta zuniensis. These sponges have allowed the growth of the exceptional fauna you can see before your eyes. They participate in the construction of reefs, but not only that. According to research conducted by a team of Chinese scientists in Wuhan, it appears that the filtering activities of these animals have encouraged not only ventilation, but also the oxygenation of the oceans and thus by extension, the development of marine life. Many have taken up residence near these aquatic architects. Among them are our trilobites that are never far away, but also other species like Anomalocaris trilobites, a small shelled being, and Protohertzina anabarica, a possible protoconodont. All these potential prey are sure to whet the appetite of the local predators. One of them is lurking nearby. It belongs to the Anomalocarids. These marine giants, equipped with prehensile arms and powerful jaws, navigate the waters like true masters of the oceans. It's fair to say that here, they're at the top of the food chain, so there's plenty of reason to be arrogant and presumptuous. Although its name, Anomalocaris, means strange shrimp, make no mistake, it could reach 1 meter or 3 feet in length and was a formidable hunter. What is most incredible and impressive about this marine creature is undoubtedly its mouth. It has sharp, ring-shaped bony plates, while its stalked eyes, swimming flaps, and prehensile appendages are undeniably hunting assets. It's undoubtedly its mouth that makes this animal the most formidable predator of the Cambrian oceans. Anomalocaris, nevertheless, favored worms, which were more digestible and required less effort. Within the Anomalocaris, as with trilobites, different species can be observed with distinct characteristics. In the case of Patia, for example, you can see a 4-part mouth, devilishly efficient, while in Herdia, small spines can be observed in the middle of the mouth, an invaluable aid in tackling some of its favorite delicacies. These new morphological adaptations allow Anomalocaris, but also more broadly its family, the radiodonts, to become unparalleled predators. Varied and developed reefs, numerous small prey feeding by filtering phytoplankton or by digging into the soil, a few predators to regulate this ensemble. Here we have the first food chain in the history of life, a true ecosystem. These primitive ecosystems are mosaics of unique forms and behaviors, where each species struggles to survive in a new world. Before the Cambrian, there was never a period so rich in animal and plant life. We've seen a few specimens so far, but there are thousands more we could mention, as the period is so flourishing. Among arthropods, for example, there's Brachiocaris, a bivalve arthropod measuring less than 10 centimeters or 4 inches. It moves quite well in the water for its time. It has a segmented trunk and a forked tail. At the front, you can see a pair of antennules, as well as a pair of claw-shaped appendages. It's thanks to these appendages that it can bring to its mouth the food it desires. A bit further, you can see a strange specimen that's still difficult to classify, Wiwaxia. Strange, yet remarkable, with its famous rows of dorsal spines. A formidable defense tactic against predators like the Anomalocaris. Other small creatures could serve as dinner for numerous predators, such as Opabinia, with its flexible body and trunk-like mouth. Hallucigenia was regularly hunted as well. It is quite exceptional from a morphological perspective. For a long time, we were lost as to the animal's orientation. Which end could we consider the head? Eventually, neither end seems to have a mouth. Its dorsal spines were even mistaken for legs, which goes to show how puzzling the animal is. We have mentioned some arthropods so far, but it should be noted that they were quite numerous at the time. We can add to the long list the group Sydnea and Morella, each adopting a very different form. Sydnea has a rather flat, oval shape, with small legs and long antennae. It primarily feeds on mollusks. Morella, on the other hand, has a horseshoe-shaped cephalic shield. Its discoverer, Walcott, nicknamed it the lace crab. Its form is so peculiar and original that scientists have a hard time classifying it among arthropods or even trilobites. We know equally little about its diet, though at least for Morella, we know where its head and legs are. However, we can imagine that it swims or walks on the seabed. Based on studies conducted on the fossils of this species, it has highly developed gill filaments on the first pairs of appendages. This part of its body might serve as a filter. The second pair of antennae might then help guide particles to the mouth afterwards. We can also see a sort of marine centipede climbing on the young reef, likely an Achaia. Not far away, there's also a Canidaspis, which is the oldest known crustacean. In this group, you will later find crabs and lobsters, for example. Our Canidaspis shows a morphology that evokes these modern animals. It has a sort of segmented tail, a body covered by a carapace, several legs, and fins. This crustacean is a benthic animal. We can see it here digging in the soil to unearth its food from the sediments. To conclude on the Cambrian Explosion and its multitude of new species, I would like to talk about Picaia. It might be our oldest ancestor. It's a bit crazy to think that we might descend from such an ancient fish, isn't it? Everything is still yet to be proven, but one thing is certain. Picaia is indeed a chordate, and it is a vertebrate, and not just any vertebrate, since it's the oldest known chordate to date. While it is the most popular, it wasn't the only marine fish of the ocean at the time. Indeed, Myllocamingia was also part of its universe, and their maritime paths must have crossed already. The latter has a cartilage skeleton and is also among the very first vertebrates in the animal world. In the same geological layers, scientists have also found Haikuela, another primitive chordate. However, Picaia is the most well-known of these fossil chordates. We know it measures between 5 and 10 centimeters, or around 2 and 4 inches, and it has adopted a long, eel-like shape. Its head is very small in proportion to the rest of its body. Researchers believe it was a detritivore, as remnants of mud have been found in its pharynx. The most plausible hypothesis is that it adopted a nectobenthic lifestyle, where the animal feeds on suspended particles or sediment. Mobile, it must have spent most of its time on the ocean floor. As you traversed these ancient waters, you observed that a complex food chain centered around phytoplankton, the primary source of marine energy, gradually established itself in the world's seas. The protective shells of some small marine species, notably trilobites, emerged as a response to predation, marking a key stage in evolution. The Cambrian is ultimately a time when biological innovations are numerous. Species test, adapt, and perfect their strategies like never before. Their goal is to conquer this ever-changing environment. Occasionally, as we've seen in some species, this results in truly peculiar forms. So peculiar that we experience difficulties classifying them or even determining where the front and back of the body are. Nevertheless, these more or less ingenious innovations have allowed our oceans to diversify and see the blossoming of the first food chains and the first developed and stable ecosystems. But how, or rather why, did this rapid evolution happen during the Cambrian and not before or after? What factors may have favored this process in the living world? The first explanation lies in the new composition of the water. There are some chemical elements that were not present before, at least not in abundance as they are in the Cambrian, and which triggered an evolutionary response in the living world. These include oxygen and calcium first, but also iron, potassium, and silica. These elements favor the emergence of new ecological niches. It's possible that these, assimilated by some of the marine creatures we've observed, allowed them to develop their means of defense, the shell or external skeleton. We must also acknowledge that living organisms from the end of the Precambrian have new genetic makeup that allows them to specialize and develop an adapted anatomy, such as limbs or eyes. Thanks to these new genetic backgrounds, species can continue their race of adaptation. This journey into the Cambrian is a living lesson about the origins of life as we know it. Before this pivotal period in our history, there was no member of the fauna or flora as we can imagine it today. Aside from some forms of algae, jellyfish, and rare shells, a few millimeters or 0 inches at most, there is not much to remind us of our current world. The beginnings are promising, indeed, but they remain quite fragile and very distant from modern plants and animals. Then, in the Cambrian, life takes on new momentum. Everything expands. Here, the ancestors of arthropods, mollusks, and even chordates reveal themselves to us, giving rise to the large branches of the tree of life. We see groups emerging, such as worms, the first shells, or mollusks. Groups still existing today, but also other vanished groups, like trilobites or radiodonts. We can speak of coevolution here. If the diversification of species was so rapid, it's because in this newly emerged world, everything was to be created, and all had to adapt as best as possible to hope to survive. Prey must evolve to fight increasingly strong predators. Either their anatomy must favor escape, or they must develop natural defenses such as solid and protective exoskeletons. In contrast, predators must also adapt to overcome these new prey with infallible armor. Geological upheavals are omnipresent. The movement of tectonic plates, sea level fluctuations, and sedimentary deposits sculpt this primitive world. Depending on these variations, life adapts as best as it can. These phenomena perfectly illustrate the deep links between geology and the evolution of life. Major climatic or geological changes force these living organisms to adapt to new conditions if they wish to survive. A divide will indeed occur at the end of the Cambrian, giving rise to the time of extremes, the Ordovician. Each period is marked by one or more significant events, upheavals drastic enough to create a fault line, a break between the before and the after. Between the Cambrian and the Ordovician, several notable changes took place. First, geographically speaking, the movement of the plates gave a new face to the Earth. At that time, there were several continents: Gondwana, which gathered South America, Africa, India, and even Australia and Antarctica; Laurentia, which represents North America; and finally, Siberia and Baltica, two other emerging lands found in the intertropical zone. The movement of the plates caused the massive continent of Gondwana to tilt more and more toward the South Pole. The Iapetus Ocean, which separates Baltica from Laurentia, gradually closes while on the other side, between Baltica and Gondwana, a new ocean forms, the Rhaetic Ocean. These transforming oceans, coupled with intense activity of the Rhaetic Oceanic Ridge, led to overflows. The sea level skyrocketed, reaching nearly 200 meters or 656 feet higher than the current level. The climate was equally changing. Initially, the Ordovician was rather warm, with the largest tropical zone of all geological times, yet paradoxically, a polar cap gradually formed in the southern hemisphere. The Earth's average temperature slowly decreased. Toward the end of the period, the climate drastically hardened with a sudden glaciation, a striking contrast with the tropical waters at the beginning of the era, forcing species to adapt to survive these new living conditions. The Ordovician is a time of spectacular transformations, following the most beautiful aspects of the Cambrian. You have often heard the term benthic when talking about the way of life of previous animals. In the Cambrian, animal life almost exclusively occupied the ocean floor. In other words, they were benthic or demersal and benthic. During the Ordovician, a new playground opened for marine creatures, the water column. Indeed, it was no longer about just exploring the ocean floor, but also swimming freely upwards. We now speak of the pelagic zone and pelagic animals. Scientists, in order to better understand and study different aquatic species, have compartmentalized the oceans into different water volumes. Simply put, the water column is located between the bottom and the surface of the ocean. This same water column is further divided into subcompartments, such as the epipelagic zone and the mesopelagic zone, for example. For now, we will only talk about the water column in the broad sense, using the term pelagic, which comes from pelagos, meaning open sea. Shallow, vast, and rich seas thus become cradles for flourishing biodiversity. Imagine yourself floating above one of these primitive reefs, where budding corals create real underwater gardens for brachiopods and trilobites, while in the higher areas, vertebrates and cephalopods swim in open waters. No living organism had yet made this region of the sea its home. We might not be celebrating the first steps on dry land yet, but still, this new occupation of the oceans is a small feat in itself for the marine world. During the Ordovician, the abundance of life reached its peak. With a suitable diving suit, imagine yourself swimming among these creatures from millions of years ago. You might glimpse ostracoderms, jawless fish with armored bodies, roaming the seafloor. You would admire some creatures making their first steps, or rather their first swimming strokes, in the pelagic waters. Never before had marine creatures managed to move so easily in the water. And what about the first coral reefs? True wonders. They are blooming, developing, strengthening, creating shelters for varied creatures. Every corner of these seas harbors stories of adaptation and survival. Before discussing the pelagic zone, even though the idea is tempting, let's stay a while longer at the bottom of the water. We just talked about reefs. As early as the Cambrian, these marine ecosystems had developed extensively. During the Ordovician, this was still the case. New species were found, and a reef that was ever richer and more varied. The one in the shape of a vertical cylinder right here is an Olecera. It is close to the sponge family, part of the stromatoporoids. It produces a skeleton of calcium carbonate. It's far from being the only one. Behind these green algae, Winnipegia, you can see a member of the bryozoan family. They are sometimes called moss animals. They too produce their skeleton with calcium carbonate and thus contribute to the construction of the reef. Not far away, other bryozoans, more leafy than branched this time, occupy the surface. This is a heterotripa. It can reach 50 centimeters or 20 inches. In addition to the bryozoans, sponges, and other algae, one also finds corals, particularly solitary corals. These are the animals you see right here, tube-shaped with outgrowths on top. They look like sea anemones. At the foot of these corals is a sponge, Brachyspongia, which can measure up to 30 centimeters or 12 inches and is beloved by animals we have already encountered many times, trilobites. One of the largest of the period was undoubtedly the trilobite Isotolis, with its size that could exceed 70 centimeters or 28 inches. There's no doubt it greatly appreciated the shelter and abundant food offered by Brachyspongia, just like its fellow Calamene. Unfortunately for it, between the Cambrian and the Ordovician, there's a small change it will have to prepare for. If the ocean floor offers more and more shelter and food, it has also allowed predators to develop and diversify. Here is Megalograptus, one of the largest trilobite eaters. It measures around 80 centimeters or 31 inches and is part of the Eurypterids. They are also known as sea scorpions because of their appearance. Eurypterids are designed to hunt on the sea floor. They have an elongated body, an articulated tail, but also, and above all, several pairs of eyes, allowing them to spot even the smallest marine creature, prehensile pincers, and sometimes even raking legs to better uncover their prey from the sand. With its natatory paddles, it can swim, and with its legs, it can move on the ground. Very resourceful in the ocean, it is not very picky when it comes to the menu. It can hunt, but it can also scavenge at times, as long as it has a full belly. it's happy. In the reefs, among solitary corals, colonial corals, and sponges, one could also see animals that look a bit more like what we are used to seeing, like these starfish, for example. It is Petraster for the smaller one, and Promopolister for the larger one. Beside them, there are also sea lilies, like this Archaeocrinus. It has a partial crown and a long stem. It anchors to the sea floor, and using its feather-shaped appendages, captures small food particles. Another very interesting specimen to discover is the graptolite, or rather, the graptolites, since these animals always live in a colony. There is an initial individual called a sicula. You will also find a long central stem, then an infinite number of branches on which are small chambers where the other individuals of the colony live. Their name means written on stone. They are nicknamed this because their fossil imprint resembles hieroglyphs engraved in the rock. Graptolites are very common at the time and will remain so for a few million years. They are so prevalent and diversified that they are a valuable aid for scientists when it comes to dating a geological layer. Some of these graptolites were attached to the ground, while others were part of the plankton and drifted with the currents. You can also see mollusks. This one, a bivalve, is a member of the genus Modiolopsis. It is recognizable by its thin and elongated shell. Raphinaskina, on the other hand, is a brachiopod. It is a suspension feeder and, unlike others, lives above the seabed. Its shell is wider and convex. One of the peculiarities of these species is their shells, which grow, like trees, in increments. In other words, each age is marked with a new layer, visible and readable on its shell. These species of mollusks, trilobites, and brachiopods must face more numerous and varied predators. Besides the dangerous eurypterids we saw earlier, they must beware of the fearsome orthocerian cephalopods. The smaller of the two is a Treptoceras, the other a Camauroceras. This orthocerian cephalopod is one of the longest. While this one is already well advantaged by its size, nearly 2 meters or 7 feet, others of its kind reached 6 meters or 20 feet with no difficulty. This cephalopod is part of the nautiloids. They have a univalve shell. Unlike modern nautiluses, the orthoceres have a straight shell. However, they share with them many tentacles used to grasp and swallow their prey. The marine environment is increasingly rich. Ocean temperatures have dropped from 113 degrees, 45 Celsius. They are now around 86 degrees, 30 degrees. We are getting closer to the temperatures found in tropical oceans. Marine creatures clearly appreciate this change, which is conducive to their development, especially as the waters of the globe have become significantly enriched with nutrients, notably through the erosion of continents and the activity of ridges that bring in large quantities of mineral salts. The base of the food chain, namely filter-feeding animals, is diversifying and their numbers are exploding, which in turn allows the entire food chain to develop and multiply. The Ordovician remains to this day the period where the growth in the number of new species was most intense. The number of families tripled and the number of genera quadrupled. Each of these species also began occupying an increasingly wide range of habitats. Speaking of emerging species, it's time to meet the famous ostracoderms. The primitive fish found in the Ordovician were still few in number, but while their appearance is timid, it is nonetheless promising. These animals managed to diversify, specialize, and develop in an extraordinary manner. They will exploit several major radiations throughout the history of our planet. For now, these ostracoderm fish are agnathans. This means they have no jaws. However, ostracoderms means they had a sort of armor, a bony plate on part of their body. The name of their group, in fact, means shell skin. But that's not their only noteworthy feature. To understand the little revolution these fish managed to bring about, one must focus on their gills. Indeed, unlike how marine creatures use them up to this point, these gills will no longer serve to breathe and feed, but only to breathe. In other words, this genus paves the way for a specialization of certain systems and organs in particular. Among the ostracoderms, a multitude of species can be found. During the Ordovician, we can particularly mention Sacabambaspis. It's quite bizarre and looks more like a tadpole than a fish, but it is indeed an ostracoderm fish from the Arandaspiridae family. These animals are slow and live almost exclusively on the ocean floor. However, they have adopted new characteristics that herald major evolutions in the near future among fish, though it will probably take until the Devonian to witness one of the greatest radiations of the group. Before we address that topic, let's explore the next era, the Silurian. You don't know it yet, but the Ordovician ends on a tragic note. An unprecedented climatic crisis likely originates, among other factors, from the sudden glaciation of the Earth. While biological growth was exceedingly rapid at the beginning of the period, this time biodiversity collapses. Nearly 1 in 4 families and 1 in 2 genera disappear due to the Ordovician crisis. In terms of intensity, this first mass extinction takes second place on the podium of the most devastating crises after the Permian. Life, despite all the difficulties and sacrifices it had to endure, manages to resume its course. On the ashes of the Ordovician, the Silurian is born, a period rich in twists and turns. If the Ordovician was known for the incredible journey of its budding ecosystems, this time the Silurian is characterized by a true spirit of conquest. The period is short, but represents a crucial step in the Earth's history and the living world. For millions of years, life occupied only the oceans, so to speak. This time, with the arrival of the Silurian, everything changes. During the Ordovician, green algae, cyanobacteria, and even lichens sometimes spilled over along the banks. Now, a plant truly establishes itself on the terrestrial soil. Cooksonia is the very first plant to succeed in courting the loose earth of the coasts. This plant lives on the edge of lagoons and watercourses. Cooksonia does not yet have roots, but one can clearly distinguish a long stem and branching. The discovery of this pioneering plant is owed to William Lang, a British botanist specializing in fossil plants. He named his discovery in honor of his collaborator, Isabel Cookson. The first plants, like Cooksonia, settle on barren soils, bringing a green carpet to the edge of these arid landscapes. Time will need to work its magic, but this new green haven is an ode to life. Soon, the place will welcome an entire world. While the animal evolutions observed in aquatic animals have been incredibly diverse, we sometimes forget to mention those the plants have implemented. To be able to live outside, major adaptations were necessary. The first is the appearance of aerial organs, such as stems, leaves, or petioles. In Cooksonia, the stem, various branches, and the sporangium, an oval structure at the top of each branch emitting spores, are covered with a protective wax. Sporopollenin will also prevent spores, the plant's reproductive cells, from drying out. Cooksonia also innovates with stomata. Stomata are cells that can open and close. Why is this important here? Because this ability will allow gaseous exchange between the plant's aerial organs and the external world. The Cooksonia still have much to teach us. There is still a great deal of mystery regarding these plants, notably how they anchored to the soil, or how they managed to draw water. Scientists have, however, proposed some hypotheses regarding their functioning, particularly on the usefulness of their stem, while later on, leaves and other plant parts will facilitate photosynthesis. In Cooksonia, it might be the stem that played this role. It's also possible that plants originated from charophytes, that is, freshwater algae. Indeed, the sporopollenin we discussed earlier is already present in these aquatic plants. While it has a protective role, sporopollenin also enables the circulation of substances between two neighboring cells through tiny channels known as plasmodesmata. This would explain how Cooksonia manages so well on the surface. This first terrestrial plant will conquer the edge of watercourses and lagoons. A thin and narrow humid strip near bodies of fresh and salt water is still very limited. Just look to the horizon to see that the rest of the world still seems quite hostile. However, at our feet, these early plants are a promise. Life outside water is possible. Many will indeed try, by the end of the Silurian and the beginning of the next period, the Devonian. Plants work the soil and provide new shelters and new nutritional sources. It was enough for the first terrestrial arthropods, such as spiders, scorpions, and myriapods, to appear and taste these new delicacies. Of course, the establishment of these animals on this new territory is still very tentative. Many venture out on occasion but remain very connected to the aquatic world. Nevertheless, they are the very first animals to set foot on land. Pneumodesmus is a type of millipede. It is one of the first to occupy this new terrestrial ecological niche. Its body is segmented, and numerous legs can be seen under its body. Above each leg, a small opening can be discerned. There are relatively few exploitable fossils of this kind of specimen to confirm this hypothesis, but the scientific community is considering the possibility of spiracles. Spiracles are openings in some animals, particularly insects and arthropods, that lead to the respiratory system. It would be one of the first animals on our planet with an air-breathing respiratory system. It is one of the key species in the history of evolution. It was not alone and shared the space with Palaeophonus, a scorpion, and Atarcopus fimbriunguis, one of the oldest arachnid genera. A fossil of Atarcopus was found among plant fossils. We can easily link the spread of plants on Earth to the establishment of certain species in these regions. The spiders of that time were different from those we know today. They were, so to speak, between a spider and a scorpion. This ambivalence is evidenced by the presence of a small flagellum-shaped tail at the back of the animal's segmented abdomen. Researchers continue their studies on these fossils, but with the current state of knowledge on the subject, our spider did not produce webs for the simple reason that, unlike our modern spiders, it didn't have spinnerets. However, it had a gland under its abdomen capable of producing silk. The current hypothesis is that the silk might have been used for protection, such as wrapping eggs, or perhaps to create a wall or some sort of plug for its burrow. In the sea, nature is already in a state of excitement. Coral reefs reach new heights, offering a sanctuary for marine life. It is a time of stabilization, where life is gaining complexity. I propose that you join us in the oceans. Things have changed somewhat since we last left. The Devonian period is situated right between two orogenies. The Caledonian orogeny, driven by the collision between Avalonia and Laurentia, and the Hercynian orogeny, marked by the collision between Armorica and Laurentia. This dance of tectonic plates leads to numerous upheavals on land and in the sea. Some oceans completely close, such as the Iapetus Ocean and the Hryek Ocean. The activity is quite intense. On the climate side, things are calmer. Temperatures remain warm but stable. This allows different species to continue their courageous and extraordinary evolution. It is in the ocean that the radiations are perhaps the most impressive. Far from the slow, jawless fish of a few million years ago, we now find ourselves in an ocean filled with impressive creatures: primitive sharks, armored fish, and the first lobe-finned fish. Let's discover, without further ado, our first armored fish, and probably the most popular and impressive of its category: Dunkleosteus. It is monstrous and can reach between 4 and 8 meters, 13 and 26 feet in length. More closely related to tuna than to sharks morphologically, it had a jaw twice as large as that of a shark. It's an armored fish, a placoderm, but most importantly, a formidable predator. New studies conducted on this animal have led scientists to find a more fitting nickname for it. They call it the wrecking ball of the depths. This gives you an idea of the power of the phenomenon. Placoderms are among the first fish to have jaws. The jaw of Dunkleosteus was effective enough that you wouldn't want to put your fingers near it. This sea monster was equipped with pairs of gnathal plates, that is, bony protrusions that were as sharp as knife blades. Once the prey was caught, a simple press would literally cut it in two. Somewhat aggressive and perhaps territorial, placoderms had bony plates on their heads and thoraxes to protect their vital organs. This armor protected them from predators, but also from their fellow creatures. These marine creatures didn't hold back when it came to protecting territory. Where there are predators, there are preys. Other fish served as snacks for our Dunkleosteus. Cladocylake, for example, one of the first representatives of primitive sharks, despite its almost 2 meters, 7 feet in length, was no match for the placoderm. Even if it wasn't at the top of the chain, it was still a serious predator in the Devonian waters. We can see it here hunting in this school of acanthodians. The peculiarity of the latter is possessing characteristics of both bony fish and cartilaginous fish. We see here through this species that evolutionary processes are clearly at work. They too, like Dunkleosteus, possess jaws. They also have small ventral spines to support their fins. If at first these fish inhabited only saline waters, little by little they favored freshwater. This is also the case with Cheirolepis, which occupied both the seas and inland water bodies. Standing at 50 centimeters, 20 inches, it wasn't its size that could help against more impressive and better equipped predators. However, speed and agility became its main assets for escape. It has well-developed fins and manages perfectly in the water. To feed, as it is also a predator, it is equipped with small sharp teeth and good vision. When it spots prey, once again its speed and stability in the water allow it to swoop down on its prey. To conclude on Cheirolepis, it is important to note that it is a ray-finned fish. They are among the very first actinopterygians, a somewhat barbaric name to refer to these bony fish that will soon represent 50% of the living vertebrate species on Earth, no less. We talk about ray-finned fish because when observing the animal's skeleton, we see that the fin consists of fine spines, somewhat like the spokes of a bicycle wheel or a fan. These are covered by a thin skin webbing. Swimming is then greatly facilitated. The fins can change shape and adapt to the animal's needs or the environment. To facilitate our transition from land to sea, Ichthyostega will be our finest ambassador. A precursor of amphibians and the first described tetrapod, Ichthyostega was discovered in 1931 for the very first time in Greenland. It measures nearly 1 meter or 3 feet long and possesses true limbs with joints. Hip, knee, ankle, everything is there. Before us, a true tetrapod finally moves. The evolution of life has touched walking. Despite all this tetrapod also retains characteristics of fish. There is a caudal fin and scales on part of the body as well as gills. In other words, it is not entirely capable of moving solely on land. It is a crucial link in understanding the transition from aquatic to terrestrial life. Of course, it was not the only one to attempt the endeavor. Others before and after it tried with varying degrees of success, like Tiktaalik, Elpistostege, or Panderichthys. What differentiates Ichthyostega from these latter ones might be its forelimbs. It has somewhat of hands that give it a slight advantage over its predecessors. This is also true for Acanthostega, but it used its hands more like fins than legs. Now that we've seen who embarked on the conquest of land, it is time to see who made all of this possible. Indeed, without plants, life could never have been conceivable in this way. Since we moved past our earliest Cooksonia, the vegetation cover has greatly developed. We could speak of mini plains and small forests, as the landscape is truly radically different from anything we had seen until then. Along this lagoon, one can see that there are plants along the banks. These are Celophyton. Here again, there are no roots or leaves, but rather stems and branched clusters at the ends forming the sporangia. Of the same kind, but more spread out on the land, we can also mention Zosterophyllum. Both are vascular plants. This means that these plants have lignified tissues capable of conducting water and minerals throughout the plant. With the system still in its early stages, these plants never venture far from wet environments. Among the vascular plants, there are also Rhynia and Asteroxylon. This time, the stems seem to strengthen, like small branches. Asteroxylon is a bit larger and more robust than its neighbors. The branches can reach a little over 1 cm, or 0.4 inches in diameter, for a plant 40 cm, or 16 inches tall. We are far from the light vegetation cover solely made of mosses and lichen from a few million years ago. The race to the sun begins among plants. In the Devonian, the big winner could be Calamophyton. When referring to this species, one no longer talks about a plant, but rather a small tree. Resembling palm trees, it becomes one of the pioneers in building the first forests. It is one of the oldest trees in the world, despite its modest size, between 80 centimeters or 31 inches and 4 meters or 13 feet approximately. Among plants, there are also other species that will be talked about for a long time and whose descendants are still widely present today. These are the ferns. Cladoxylopside is part of this old and large family. Thanks to evolution, these tree-like plants are now equipped with trunks. At least, they come very close to it. The trunk of Cladoxylopside can reach 70 centimeters, or 28 inches in diameter. Inside, an entire network allows this fern to be autonomous and to extract from its environment everything it needs to live. Among the Cladoxylopside, Watiza is one of the most popular. It is one of the oldest, but also the largest ferns of its time. It could reach 8 meters or 26 feet in height, far surpassing our Calamophyton. On land, the beginnings of forests are gradually setting in. These new ecosystems bring about changes in ecology, as well as in the atmosphere. The air is changing. Finally, this new green world holds a multitude of promises and possibilities. Just look at this Rainiella precursor, the oldest known springtail in the world to be sure. Until now, there were very few terrestrial animals, yet insects find their little paradise here. They collaborate with plants to grow. The partnership, still essential today between insects and plants, begins here in the Devonian period. However, the shadow of extinctions already looms over this era. The end of the Devonian, marked by intense climatic disturbances, reminds us of the fragility of emerging ecosystems. If the bond between insects and plants is unbreakable, this new mass extinction is a lesson on the connections between environment, biodiversity, and resilience. The elements are linked to each other. It only takes one small grain of sand in the gears for everything to fall apart. In the aftermath of the crisis, thousands of species have disappeared. Chaos is at the doorstep of the living world. Fortunately, experienced and resourceful, it will rise once again and use the crisis to renew itself and adopt new adaptive strategies. Now, let's make way for the Carboniferous. With the Carboniferous, it's as if we are diving into a new era. Everything seems to have taken on such magnitude. Whether in plants or insects, everything appears oversized. The period begins with a significant rise in waters, those that make up the Paleotethys Ocean. They will overflow onto the continental shelves and offer a new habitat to some organisms in search of new ecological niches. Shallow and warm water, and it is the corals and other reef builders that will quickly take up residence there. Very quickly, other species and marine creatures will take advantage of the development of these marine shelters to settle in turn. Looking at this wonderful coral reef, one might think that things are rather calm in the Carboniferous, but that would be a gross mistake. Indeed, the dance of the continents has resumed to once again create a single landmass. This time, we will call it Pangaea. It is the result of a long process that concludes during the Carboniferous with the collision of the European, American, and also Gondwanan plates. This will also allow the Hercynian mountain chain to rise from the ground. Forests gradually invade the space, and a true vegetative cover with different layers and a variety of plant organisms is established. The Carboniferous is known for being a period of impressive and unique carbon storage. The process was long. By burying vast amounts of biomass, the Earth has modified its climate for millions of years. This demonstrates the deep interactions between vegetation and atmosphere. Before becoming a coal reserve and a fossilized biomass, this energy source was a colossal forest. First, let's look at the different types of forests, because in the Carboniferous, the plant cover diversified to such an extent that a zoning of vegetation can be distinguished. Around the equator, we find deciduous trees, one of the greatest revolutions in trees. One of the most popular trees with this ability is Glossopteris. Of course, there are many types of ferns and other small plants, like moss. In the coal forests, different layers can be observed. While small vascular plants are still present on the banks of water bodies, things have evolved significantly here, as you can see. Near the banks, we can see Sphenophyllum or calamites. Calamites are tree-like horsetails that could reach heights of 30 meters or 98 feet. Sphenophyllum, on the other hand, is a rather creeping plant that runs along the banks and wraps around the calamites. Still near these swampy water points, which make up the future coal forests, we also find other species like Lepidodendron, Sigillaria, or Chordates. On the lower level, we have the shorter plants, like ferns, which could vary in size and leaf shapes, but also seed ferns. Among these, we find Neuropteris with its small oval leaves. Some shrubs, like Ceronius, could also occupy the middle level. In these humid ecosystems, amphibians thrive. You can imagine how much such a rich plant environment with wide stretches of water could be favorable to them, since these forests are populated with cockroaches and crickets, which amphibians and other predators love. Here is one. It's a Ctenoptilus frequens. But these animals did not arrive immediately. At the beginning of the Carboniferous, there were only insects that really thrived. But that's not a bad thing, quite the contrary. Insects had time to develop and enrich their ecosystem without predators hindering their progress. Thus, a new niche was built, slowly but surely, to eventually accommodate animals of another kind. Insects would thus diversify and specialize. Some even adopted quite surprising diets. We see the appearance of detritivores carnivores, and even piercing suckers. These were the first insects to embark on the adventure of sap tasting. Initially, it was not very nutritious, as plants were still evolving. We can also see different types of flight among insects. Some limited themselves to gliding, while others were already exploring the benefits of hovering in their hunting. According to a study conducted in 2020 by Song, Shin, and Beitu, scientists closely observing the insects of the time, it seems that the emission of sounds by rubbing wings together also appeared during this period. In the Carboniferous, even though the insect population was not as diverse as it can be today, it was already very interesting and varied. We find three main groups: the Dictyopterans, which would be quite close to cockroaches, termites, or mantises. We also find Orthopterans, like Chetonoptilus frequens, which groups close relatives of crickets and grasshoppers. And finally, we can observe Paleopterans. These are relatives of dragonflies, damselflies, and mayflies. These insects adopted oversized dimensions. According to the latest results from studies on the subject, the high oxygen content would be one of the most plausible explanations for the colossal size of these individuals. One of the most popular is undoubtedly the giant dragonfly, Meganeura monyi. The buzzing of its wings must have been deafening when one was nearby. Among arthropods, we can also see some large-scale species, particularly among close relatives of arachnids, or even among millipedes, like Arthropleura armata. How could one not be frozen with fear in front of a millipede over 2.5 meters, or 8 feet long, and at least 50 centimeters or 20 inches in diameter? With almost no aerial predators, insects and arthropods could reign supreme over the Carboniferous vegetation. No other animal disturbed their peaceful tranquility. However, this could not last forever. Predators had to gradually integrate into this new food chain to preserve the balance of life and the viability of this ecosystem. It is the amphibians that will quickly find their footing. We had the opportunity to discuss one of the first specimens leaving the aquatic environment for the terrestrial environment with the arrival of Ichthyostega. It's part of those early tetrapods that used their limbs to move. Another well-known one from the late Carboniferous is Diplocaulus, recognizable by its boomerang-shaped head. Initially crawling, then adopting a gait closer to modern quadrupeds, the movement of these amphibians became one of the major evolutions of the period. Pederpes finiae, for example, shows new capabilities and skills for moving on 4 limbs. Its forelimbs feature a 6th finger, which must have helped its movement. It is perfectly adapted to terrestrial life, but it's far from the only revolution of the Carboniferous. These new semi-terrestrial, semi-aquatic creatures are also equipped with protolungs. In other words, they are both capable of enjoying the benefits of the aquatic world and of surviving on land. Some amphibians limited themselves to the aquatic world despite their group's new terrestrial capabilities, like Pholeoderpaton, resembling an eel on legs and able to measure nearly 4 meters, 13 feet long. In another style, we can mention Microbrachys pelicani, reminiscent of our axolotls. It must be said that life on land is not simple. You need to learn to support your own weight, to breathe in the open air, and to develop strong and resistant eggs. Quite an epic journey. While large insects are rather privileged in the air, on the ground, size doesn't necessarily allow for more agility. Large amphibians spend most of their lives in the water, even if they regularly venture onto land. We could compare their lifestyle to Japanese giant salamanders or even crocodiles. Smaller species, on the other hand, are more adapted to mobility on land. They extensively occupy wet areas and take advantage of their benefits to make use of both the terrestrial and aquatic world. One of the major problems these animals between two worlds can encounter concerns their reproduction. The eggs are very fragile. Therefore, they must lay in water if they want to hope for a somewhat promising future for their offspring. Because of this, amphibians cannot fully detach themselves from the aquatic world. Through newly triggered evolutionary processes, a new order is appearing, that of the lepispondal amphibians. These are reptile-shaped amphibians. Among them, we find animals resembling small lizards, like Tuditanus microsauria. Little by little, the clade of reptiles appears and foreshadows extraordinary evolutions. For now, it is those who will succeed in modifying the constitution of their eggs who will bring about the major revolution of the period, called the amniotes. These amniotes will give rise to numerous clades, like reptiles, of course, but also dinosaurs, birds, and mammals. The amniotic egg is covered with a watertight shell and filled with fluid. These adaptations mark a crucial transition to modern terrestrial life. Quickly, two distinct groups among the amniotes form. These two groups are the origin of all non-amphibian amniote tetrapods existing today. The first group is made up of the sauropsids. This includes the reptiles we just mentioned, but also dinosaurs and thus birds. The second, the synapsids, will later include mammals. Thus, the Carboniferous lays the foundation for several animal groups, but also plants that will endure to our modern era. While it remains a key period, the Carboniferous will still experience numerous geological and climatic upheavals that will lead to a biological crisis. The wet zones of Pangaea will be the most affected. This is referred to as the collapse of the rainforest. This will have multiple consequences, both positive and negative, depending on the perspective. While many animals will bear the brunt of the crisis, the non-amphibian tetrapods we mentioned will be spared. Indeed, they have freed themselves from the aquatic environment and have become fully terrestrial creatures. It is with the hope of the emergence of lizards and non-amphibian tetrapods in a broad sense that we continue our journey to our last stop, the Permian. The unification of the Earth is never without consequence. The Earth's internal activities are so intense, the plate movements so significant, that the aftermath is inevitably proportional to the changes. This time, the assembly of Pangaea is indeed complete. If we take a higher perspective, beyond the atmosphere to position ourselves near the moon, we can then see how much the Earth has changed. This immense brown spot, a single land mass shaped like a lying U, shows us how insignificant the land masses are compared to the vastness of the ocean. It's undoubtedly easier here to see that 2/3 of the planet are covered in water. The immense Pangaea rises, uniting almost all the land masses, generating scorching deserts and shallow seas that gradually disappear. This austere landscape is both fascinating and hostile. The new mountain ranges undergo significant erosion, which generates new nutrients in the soils, whether terrestrial or marine. These changes impact the climate, but also biology. Fauna and flora are taking a new turn. Initially, the plants change. Sporangia are no longer sufficient to allow reproduction, and thus the growth and development of the plants. They are therefore going to rely on a system that proved its worth in the Carboniferous, the seed. Seed plants, so discrete in the previous era, become predominant during the Permian. Among terrestrial animals, we see that amniotes have managed to achieve incredible diversification. These tetrapods are, in fact, going to dominate the world throughout the period, but we must not forget the oceans. While extraordinary revolutions have indeed taken place on Earth, the marine landscape remains just as breathtaking, and marine species are equally diverse and abundant. Terrestrial fauna reaches an incredible peak of diversity during this last period of the Paleozoic. The therapsids, ancestors of mammals, assert themselves, while seed plants replace giant ferns, adapting to arid environments. While the vegetation is initially quite similar to that of the Carboniferous, it quickly gives way to new species. In the northern hemisphere, we find conifers, such as the Walchia, while in the southern hemisphere, it is the Glossopteridales that are most present in the territory. While seed plants, also called angiosperms, develop widely to cope with the lack of water, conifers in certain areas manage to conquer ever more territory. They, for their part, use the tried-and-true reproduction technique of gymnosperms. The cones, housing the precious genetic codes allowing the emergence of a plant, offer these conifers the opportunity to conquer the entire northern area of Pangaea. This is a world of conquests and survival that continues throughout the era. Terrestrial conquest is well underway, but nothing is set in stone yet. Inventiveness, ingenuity, creativity, and, above all, perseverance are required to adapt. In plants, the conquest will continue by refining the seed reproduction system. This new wealth in plants facilitates the development of insects, and, by extension, small carnivores and herbivorous reptiles. Scutosaurus is the typical example of a herbivorous reptile living during the Permian. It lived on the Laurasia part of Pangaea. While this part of the globe constitutes today's Siberia and adopts a rather glacial climate, at the time, the region was a vast steppe semi-desert, comparable to the Gobi Desert in Mongolia, for example. Scutosaurus lived here in these steppes. It had a rather massive body and measured between 2 to 3 meters, or 7 to 10 feet long. We quickly realized that terrestrial animals have started to grow in size. They are no longer the tiny reptiles of the late Carboniferous. To feed, it would try to find oases in search of some fresh plants to munch on. The first herbivores are not yet fully adapted to this diet. To make the most of these plants, it occasionally ingests stones, called gastroliths, which serve to crush and further mash these plants. This technique will remain with many sauropods during the periods to come. Despite its significant size for the time, it is nonetheless hunted. The predators are formidable. However, it has a few assets to defend itself. Its bony armor forms a shell. It has plates and several spikes on its skull to deter hunters. This does not prevent carnivores, like Inostrancevia, a therapsid from the synapsid branch of tetrapods, from hunting Scutosaurus. Inostrancevia belongs to the Gorgonopsian genus. The Gorgonopsians are the dominant predators of the Permian. They are truly built for hunting, and will stop at nothing. Their long skull is equipped with canines and incisors ready to hold on tight. The jaw opens much wider than average, allowing for powerful attacks. According to scientists, Gorgonopsians likely acted like saber-toothed tigers. They relied on exhaustion. With their razor-sharp teeth and oversized jaw, they could bite and cause serious wounds. Then, they took no risks and withdrew. But they didn't give up. They stayed in the shadows and monitored the first signs of the animal's exhaustion. Then it was just a matter of helping themselves. These dominant creatures of the Permian are not necessarily very large. Many of them are quite modest in size, although some can reach over 3 meters or 10 feet long. There are currently 36 species of this genus, including Dinogorgon, Lycaonops, Leontosaurus, Ruhuhucerberus, and Smilesaurus. If the Permian gradually becomes an increasingly dry period, there are still very humid areas, particularly within 10 degrees of latitude around the equator. In these regions, we can find animals favoring swamps, such as pariasaurs. Among these large anapsid reptiles, the tactic of armor as a defensive weapon is prevalent. This large herbivore, nearly 3 meters or 10 feet long, follows suit and is equipped with a rather effective dermal armor. Unfortunately, in the event of an attack by organized predators, its chances of survival are greatly reduced. Lycanthropes easily venture into this big game hunting, going after dicynodonts or animals like our pariasaur, which are quite slow and thus easy prey. In this marshy region, we still find Diplocaulus, our lepospondal amphibian. It is prey to new predators such as Dimetrodon. Contrary to popular belief, Dimetrodon is not a dinosaur. We have not reached that point in the evolution of life. It is a member of the synapsids we talked about earlier. Species of this genus can vary in weight and size. While the smallest may weigh less than 30 kilograms or 66 lbs for 1.5 meters or 5 feet, the largest can exceed 250 kilos or 551 lbs and reach more than 4.5 meters or 15 feet in length. Observing its silhouette, one might find some resemblance to a giant iguana, apart from the fact that it is equipped with a massive dorsal sail. Our Dimetrodon is a carnivore and quite a good hunter. Its name means 2 sizes of teeth. Indeed, it has 1 or 2 pairs of teeth resembling canines and many large incisors. Behind these caniniform teeth, it has an array of small teeth that get progressively smaller as they move away from the jaw. Each genus of Dimetrodon could have specialized dentition depending on the prey hunted. As the main predator of the period, quadrupedal synapsids attack all ecosystems. They can feed on fish, small tetrapods, reptiles, or even amphibians, as was the case for our Diplocaulus with a boomerang-shaped head. However, amphibians could be quite surprising at the time. They were not all situated at the bottom of the chain. On the contrary, some were very good predators. They did not keep this prime position for long, as the competition from synapsids and other reptiles was very strong. But in the Permian, hope was still present. Ariops, for example, is a labyrinthodont amphibian. It measures about 2 meters or 7 feet long, sometimes more for the larger specimens. Imagine an adult can weigh up to 200 kilos or 441 lbs, which is really enormous for an amphibian if we compare the data with our modern members of this large family. What interests us here are its predation abilities. There are 3 pairs of backward curved fangs located at the level of the palate. This might seem a bit odd at first glance, but such dentition is a true asset when teasing fish. Prey often slippery and difficult to catch. We find Ariops in many bodies of water, from ponds to rivers. It is an animal of the plains and not of swamps. Regularly surfacing once adult, this creature is considered semi-aquatic. It began its first days in the water, as an egg, then in the larval state. Then, once adult, it more easily heads towards the land. At least that's what scientists have been able to determine by observing its body, particularly its torso. It has a very rigid body and a rather robust tail. This lack of flexibility would be a real handicap for swimming, yet it feeds on fish and aquatic tetrapods. The various evolutionary stages of its predecessors allow it today to live most of its time on land. If that's the choice of Ariops, it is not the choice of the creatures we are going to see now. These have favored the marine world. Some of them even reached the top of the chain and dominated this aquatic universe by becoming true terrors of the seas. At the bottom of the water, we find our eternal marine shelters, the famous reefs. They are still incredibly beautiful and teeming with life. The Permian coral reefs are rich and diverse, one of the foundations on which ecosystems rest. We can see that new architects have settled in, like the giant sponges Gigantospongia, which can measure up to 2 meters or 7 feet. These immense yellow sponges are true living hotels. The first to benefit from them are the brachiopods, like this spirifer. Its elongated shell has a horizontal hinge, shaped like wings. It is a suspension feeder and has chosen a sessile and benthic lifestyle. It anchors its body with a peduncle. In another style and shape, we can see a brachiopod like Leptidus, which is more similar in shape to an oyster. This part of the reef is teeming with life. Others also move around this formidable pantry, the nautiloids. They are still very present in the Permian, but some display new forms. This Cuperoceras, for example, has a shell adorned with delicate defensive spines. We can also see many fish swimming around these sponges, ray-finned fish, like this Dirypterus about 15 centimeters or 6 inches long, or this Platysimus. Bony fish with fleshy fins are still very present, notably the Sarcopterygians, lungfish, and coelacanths. There are also cartilaginous fish. These continue to develop and diversify, enriching the order of hybodonts. Equipped with a powerful jaw, they can attack all sorts of animals with shells or armor. In freshwaters, a different kind of predator is at work, a reptile. Mesororis is an aquatic reptile that has made its home in lakes and ponds. It can measure up to 1 meter or 3 feet long and moves by undulating its body. Its sweet spot, crustaceans, and other small freshwater prey. Equipped with numerous small, elongated, thin, and pointed teeth, it quite easily achieved its goals. Let's take advantage of the discovery of this animal to discuss another topic, research. Studying the past is always a very complex task. How did we discover, for example, that certain continents were once connected? Of course, multiple concordant elements are needed to support a hypothesis, but the study of a few fossils, like that of our Mesororis, was crucial. Its anatomy does not allow it to swim long distances. They are quite poor swimmers, even though their banana-shaped thick ribs allowed them to dive for hunting. Yet, we have found fossils of these animals in America, but also in Africa. The distance separating one from the other is far too great for this aquatic reptile to have crossed it. This means that these two continents were once connected. This is, in any case, one clue among others that supports the famous theory of continental drift. Speaking of continental drift, despite the splendid radiations among animals, both on land and sea, a lush vegetation, ecosystems of incredible richness, and ecological niches teeming with life, a catastrophe is once again at the doorstep of life on Earth. The Siberian traps. Volcanism triggers a true climatic cataclysm. The oceans are quickly asphyxiated. Temperatures are infernal. The air unbreathable. The rain acidic. And life plunges into a world without light, deprived of the sun. The Permian-Triassic crisis is the largest and most terrible our planet has known. 90 to 95% of marine life and 70% of terrestrial life disappear. This extinction redefines the future of the planet and reshuffles the cards, giving way to a new era, that of the reptiles. But this is another story, another journey.
The Triassic period spans around 50 million years, between 252 and 201 million years ago. It's relatively short compared with other periods of the Paleozoic or Mesozoic, but it's still a very long time span on the human scale. As you can imagine, over so many years on a planetary scale this time, there have been many changes. Put another way, it's 10,000 times 5,000 years, a period long enough to see many twists and turns. The Triassic, like previous periods, is divided into subperiods. This division is necessary to better understand the various changes that take place, and ultimately, the history of the period as a whole. There is the Lower Triassic, the Middle Triassic, and finally, the Upper Triassic. Each of these periods is marked by a major change and a particular dynamic. The Triassic is, so to speak, a play in 3 acts. From 252 to 245 million years ago, the first act of our play, the Lower Triassic, laid the foundations for a new world that took hold during the Mesozoic. It itself comprises 2 subperiods, 2 important scenes, if we remain in the register of theater: the Indusian and the Olenekian. Some species became extinct, others took their place, and all this took place in a very specific climate and world geography. During the Middle Triassic, the second act of our play, which runs from 245 million to 228 million years ago, we see the Triassic world expand, diversify, and enrich itself with new species and ecological niches. It too is made up of 2 stages, 2 subperiods, called Anisian and Ladinian. Finally, the Upper Triassic, from 228 to 201 million years ago, is the last act of this play. It closes the chapter on the unprecedented upheavals that take place on the scene. Indeed, while a number of species seem to be stable and expanding throughout the Middle Triassic period, new events are about to shake up the existing scenario. This Upper Triassic period is divided into 3 scenes, 3 distinct subperiods: the Carnian, the Norian, and the Retian. While each of these scenes is of course important to our story, to simplify matters we'll refer to acts rather than scenes, i.e., the Lower, Middle, and Upper Triassic periods. To fully grasp all the issues at stake in the Triassic period, we need to keep each of these acts in mind and understand what defines them. The Triassic period saw a diversity of animal species during its course. In fact, life flourished to varying degrees during the period. The Lower Triassic, for example, the first act of the Triassic era, is a key stage in history. It symbolizes the renewal of life on Earth and in the saline waters of the globe. It corresponds to a period that could be described as transitional. The living world must gradually recover from the ordeals it has been through. After such a crisis, ecosystems are completely destroyed. The beginnings of the Triassic period were very difficult, and the Triassic Earth was far from being a prosperous and happy place. During the Paleozoic, as we've seen repeatedly on our travels, mass extinctions invariably closed the doors on previous worlds. The Earth will never again be as it was. But as the years go by, it reinvents itself and nature awakens anew. Time does its work and a new world emerges. The ashes of the past become the soil of the future. It is the prospect of this future that the Triassic period ultimately represents, and why it is so important in the history of our planet. It marks the beginning of a completely new era, the Mesozoic, also known as the Age of the Dinosaurs. This new era is synonymous with renewal on land and in the oceans. many changes are bound to occur. Climate, fauna, flora, geography. Everything was turned upside down, but these changes were undoubtedly necessary for evolution to resume its course. The Triassic is a period when life renews itself, and many lineages will even reach us. Crocodiles, turtles, certain insects, and new corals and sea urchins are just a few examples. This heritage also includes the dinosaurs, of which birds are a part. These avian dinosaurs still roam our skies today, flying majestically overhead. But the Triassic is a complex equation made up of several phases, and let's not forget that the constitution of this new world and this heritage were built over millions of years. Let's go back to the lower Triassic, around 250 million years ago, and try to understand together the main events that define this very special period. So here we are, 250 million years ago. The Permian is closing its doors, while the Triassic is opening wide. The extinction has left deep scars all over the Earth's surface, not least in the vast ocean that covers most of the globe. Neither Pangaea nor Panthalassa were spared the multiple upheavals that marked the upper Permian. Life seems to have stopped there. After a few million years, however, the vegetation cover helped animals to repopulate the land. First of all, the few survivors of the Great Extinction were given free rein to conquer large territories on this vast land, which seems virtually untouched by ecosystems. They settled in new ecological niches left vacant after the disappearance of previous living beings. This gives them the opportunity to diversify at will and rebuild the living world. Rebuild, but also renew and diversify. Indeed, the surviving species are far from being the only ones to populate the Earth. New species enrich the various ecosystems. This is known as radiation or speciation. Species will evolve to adapt to their new environment and occupy the places left vacant since the chaos of the Permian. But before we meet these species, and I can imagine your curiosity and impatience, we need to know what we're getting into. Before we talk about the characters in our Triassic play, we need to know the context in which they evolve, if we are to understand all that's at stake. What's the Earth like at this point in our history? What's the weather like? Do you remember the famous continental waltz? The movement of tectonic plates and the effervescent activity of the Earth had led to the emergent lands coming together, uniting to give birth to a single supercontinent, Pangaea. At the beginning of the Triassic, the configuration of our planet was much the same as in the Permian. Panthalassa, the vast ocean, covered most of the globe, while Pangaea formed a single continent. From a vantage point nestled in the stars, we can see just how lonely Pangaea seems, almost fragilely isolated in the middle of this oversized expanse of water. Earth has never lived up to its nickname of Blue Planet more than at this time. From here, in the hollow of the C-shaped Pangaea, you can also see an ocean that appeared during the Permian, the Tethys Ocean. This paleo-ocean is teeming with life, a veritable marine nursery where numerous species were able to hatch and diversify. This was already the case in the Permian, but will continue to be the case in the Triassic. This ocean is one of the great protagonists of Triassic history. It was to evolve considerably over the course of the Earth's history, but particularly during this period. In particular, it rushed into faults such as the Hercynian chain, paving the way for the formation of the future Atlantic Ocean. We're in the middle of Proto-Gondwana, the southern part of Pangaea. No living beings, all is desert and dust. The climate is very harsh. It's easy to understand how hostile such an environment is to all forms of life, whether plant or animal. So how did dinosaurs settle on Earth at this time? Well, we need to qualify the statement about the prevailing climate and greenhouse effect. It would be a mistake to claim that the entire continent, except for the coasts, was arid and dry, even if it is true that many areas were very dry. While large parts of the continent are arid and do not benefit from the humidity of the air, there is one place on Pangaea that is quite different from the rest. To get a better idea, let's leave the Proto-Gondwana lands and head for the Triassic roof of the world, the Hercynian chain. This chain, like the Tethys Ocean we mentioned a moment ago, is an important protagonist in Triassic history. Its role is even crucial to the survival of flora and fauna. Without it, perhaps everything would have been different. The Hercynian chain, formed when Laurasia and Proto-Gondwana collided, sets the pace for climate and precipitation. This chain is so high that it's right up close to the clouds. It therefore has a major influence on the course of clouds, just like the Himalayas today. Blocked on one side, the clouds never flood the other side with their life-giving fertile water, leaving a barren, dry, and hostile landscape. Just what we saw in Proto-Gondwana. But let's climb those mountains and find ourselves on the other side, the Laurasia side. This time things look very different. There's plenty of humidity. Despite a climate that's as hot as ever, there's plenty of water and much greater humidity in the air. This humidity favors the development of vegetation and allows different species to occupy varied ecological niches. On this side of the mountain, life is therefore entirely possible, and even flourishing once the biological shock of the late Permian has passed, many years later. In short, on one side we find a warm, humid climate, on the other a hot, terribly dry one. As a result, a large proportion of terrestrial animals settled on the land, benefiting from the humidity. To get a better view of the world as a whole, let's take a look at the map of our present-day world. Here we can see the locations of fossil discoveries dating back to the Triassic period. We can clearly see that there are far more of them in the northern hemisphere than in the southern hemisphere, which corroborates this climatic division. In fact, the northern hemisphere corresponds to Laurasia. On these lands, vegetation has had a much better chance of developing, and thus favoring the development of fauna. Conversely, on the Proto-Gondwana side, in this hostile landscape, life seems to have had a hard time finding its place. Vegetation is virtually non-existent, and without it, the chances of seeing an ecosystem flourish are diminishing. Speaking of vegetation, let's take this opportunity to enter the Triassic forest to see how it managed to emerge from the crisis. By the end of the Permian, we could see that alongside spore-bearing plants, new plants had emerged. Reproduction by sporangia was not always possible, depending on the environment and climate. To meet new needs, seed plants had to enter the scene. After a timid appearance in the Permian, these plants developed more widely in the Triassic. Despite this, vegetation got off to a rather rocky start in the Triassic. The Permian extinction did not spare them. Sigillaria, lepidodendrons, Picopterus ferns, and the famous Glossopteris were devastated and disappeared forever from the terrestrial plant cover. However, while flora was affected by the Permian extinction, it was less so than the animal world, whether marine or terrestrial. As a result, plants were able to develop and grow more rapidly. Little by little, the formation of a shelter and nutritional resource for fauna seems to be taking shape. After just a few thousand years, we can say that vegetation is once again flourishing on Earth, offering a protective cocoon for any form of life wishing to settle there. In the Northern Hemisphere, conifers are gradually taking over the territory. We can see, for example, species of the genus Voltsia. This plant must have been quite similar to some of today's conifers, notably cypress or the Araucaria genus. However, it was never taller than a shrub. Initially bordering the coastline before growing a little further into the heart of the continent, these shrubs undoubtedly enabled some species to survive this transitional period after the Permo-Triassic crisis. They were also able to create mangroves in certain parts of the coastline, providing a less arid climate more conducive to the growth of rich, diverse ecosystems. Now that we're standing at the foot of these Voltsias at the mouth of this river, why not continue our investigations and discover what the oceanic universe has to teach us? The marine world bore the brunt of the Great Extinction. Scientists estimate that nearly 95% of marine species have disappeared. Let's see how life is gradually returning to this aquatic universe. So here we are in the middle of the Tethys. The water's great, isn't it? The temperature is ideal for taking a dip and immersing ourselves a little deeper. Things have changed in the ocean since the blessed days of the Permian. The landscape, first ravaged by extinction, has once again seen a flourishing and rich aquatic life. But not all species have made it this far. The Paleozoic was the golden age of trilobites. Proliferating in abundance in all the world's oceans, they gradually declined, disappearing completely at the end of the Permian. After the Permo-Triassic crisis, coral reefs also struggled to recover. Hexacoralliar corals, i.e. modern corals, took advantage of this vacancy to the benefit of tetracoralliar corals. The Mesozoic was also known as the Golden Age of ammonites and sea urchins. Ammonites are considered stratigraphic markers. This means that given their great diversification and proliferation through the ages, scientists are now able to determine the age of the rock in which a fossil of one of these ammonites is found. Nicknamed sea hedgehogs, sea urchins now populate shallow seas alongside starfish. In the rest of the water column, life is equally varied. Indeed, in this seascape, in addition to ammonites, sea urchins, and several thousand varied mollusks, we also find a species, or rather a group, that we have already encountered on our previous trips, notably in the Permian. These are the chondrichthyans, distant cousins of sharks. These primitive sharks, if we can put it that way, gradually become the kings of the oceans during the Paleozoic. Chondrichthyans are divided into two subclasses: the elasmobranch subclass, to which rays and sharks belong, and the holocephalon subclass, to which chimeras belong. Holocephalons have their upper jaw completely attached to the neurocranium, whereas this is only partially the case with elasmobranchs. Another notable physical difference is in the gill openings. These are of two types: a single opening in holocephalons and 5 to 7 gill slits, which are very characteristic of sharks and rays. After the Great Extinction, many chondrichthyan species are in decline. However, their demise is far from certain, as some of them will manage to survive despite the obstacles they face. Their ability to occupy the deep sea is undoubtedly what enabled them to survive during this difficult period. According to the fossil record, these chondrichthyans did not return to the surface until 35 million years later, but more on that later. Some chondrichthyans continue to evolve during this period. Xenocanths can be found in this aquatic world. A distant cousin of the shark, the xenocanth silhouette bears some resemblance to our modern-day sharks. It does, however, have more and differently shaped fins on its flank. It also has a long spine at the top of its head. As far as this spine is concerned, scientists can't say what its precise purpose is. However, one hypothesis is that it could be a predatory tool, rather like the venomous stingers of modern-day stingrays. Other chondrichthyan species have also found their way into the oceans. The most common of these in the Triassic period are the hybodonts, which we'll be looking at straight away. These evolved considerably over the period. At the beginning of the Triassic period, they were only a few tens of centimeters long, so they preyed on prey at the height of their capacity and opportunity. But from the Middle Triassic onwards, we discover species that are far more generous in terms of size. Some now easily reach 3 meters or 10 feet in length. As you'd expect, their prey has changed too, and they've adapted to a completely different environment. At first, they tended to prefer freshwater, but little by little they've acclimatized to the salty waters of the coast. As their prey became much larger, their dentition evolved. In Hypodus, we can observe teeth cut to tear. They are perfectly sharp and razor sharp. In others, such as Tribodus, we're faced with another type of dentition that could be described as crushing. Previous sea urchins and ammonites have undoubtedly paid the price. Thanks to their respectable size, swimming ability, and sharp teeth, hybodonts have risen to the top of the food chain, but they're far from alone, sharing the top spot with other sea monsters. The warm, shallow waters of the Tethys offer an extraordinarily rich marine world. As we have already seen, some species have acclimatized quite well to their new world, but they are far from alone. Other species have even benefited from one of the greatest radiations, so to speak, of the entire Mesozoic. These are marine reptiles. These land animals were among the first to reach the ocean to adapt. The continent, as we've seen, can be very dry, and therefore a rather hostile terrain for terrestrial life to flourish. Their preferred playground is the coastline. Indeed, they are most numerous in coastal areas. Some are aquatic, others semi-aquatic, while others still raise questions, like this, Tanystropheus. Its name means long vertebrae. Now you know why. This Mesozoic phenomenon was first discovered over 150 years ago in Germany. Imagine how big the surprise must have been when paleontologists unearthed a skeleton nearly 6 meters or 20 feet long, with a neck that alone measures almost 3 times the size of its body. Conversely, it has a small head and a modest tail. This reptile has long been the subject of scientific debate. At first, it was thought to be semi-aquatic, then predominantly aquatic. It's its long, stiff, disproportionate neck that raises questions. Unlike similar species such as the plesiosaurs, its neck was so rigid that it could neither bend nor twist. Under these conditions, its movements and hunting strategies must have been difficult. Still, scientists have managed to unravel some of its mysteries. It feeds mainly on small fish, and its neck is its best fishing asset. It can attack by surprise and hunt in open water, although it is a poor swimmer, or from the bank by plunging its long neck to the bottom. Convenient for fishing, but that long neck was probably its undoing. According to recent studies, this long, stiff neck made Tanystropheus an easy prey for predators. It was decapitated in a single bite. At least that's what the fossilized remains have shown. There is a clear trace of dental perforation, and the neck is broken in a single backward fracture. Importantly, the results also show that the attack was carried out from above, i.e. in the water. He's not a good swimmer, he's not dexterous in the water, and he's far from fast. What's more, he can't control and direct his neck to protect himself. Attacking from above, knowing that a single bite is fatal, he has no way of escaping. Given the reptile's size, not just any predator could take on such a behemoth. 3 suspects are in the running. Most are piscivorous, but they're not averse to eliminating a potential competitor. Let's find out together. The first is undoubtedly the Nothosaurus giganteus. It measured almost 7 meters or 23 feet in length. It belongs to the diapsids. After a timid attempt in the Permian, diapsids invaded the marine environment, and Nothosaurus was one of the most important of them. With their short webbed feet, Nothosaurians lived like today's seals, returning to land to rest and lay eggs. Their elongated necks ended in flattened heads. The jaws bristling with long, sharp teeth leave no doubt as to the animal's diet. Contrary to popular belief, they are not exclusively aquatic. Indeed, to lay eggs, for example, it undoubtedly travels to the coast. The Nothosaurus family is probably the most speciated marine reptile of the Triassic period. During this period, almost a third of all species belong to this group. Let's take a look at Symbospondylus. It belongs to the ichthyosaur group. Ichthyosaurs were quite numerous in the lower Triassic, but this group declined somewhat in the middle Triassic. They were confined to the coastline and were rather modest in size, their diet being limited to animals with shells. Symbospondylus, on the other hand, is better adapted to the open sea and moves easily away from the coast, so it's easier for them to get by. It looks a bit like our modern dolphins and measures between 6 and 10 meters or 33 feet in length. With its tail accounting for around half of its total length, scientists believe this animal had an undulating swim. Thanks to its tail, it was able to gain speed and even accelerate to surprise its prey. It hunted mainly schools of fish, but perhaps he's not entirely innocent when it comes to the Tanystropheus attack. Finally, there's Helveticosaurus, another marine reptile from the Triassic period. With its long, flexible tail, it too had to swim sideways. It is, however, a little smaller than our previous reptile, measuring around 2 meters or 7 feet. Even so, it's still pretty formidable. While many of the reptiles we encountered have rather elongated, narrow skulls, this one has a robust, wider one. Its rather broad, powerful neck and sharp jaw made it a great marine predator. Its long, curved, conical teeth took on its victims with disconcerting ease. Perhaps our Tanystropheus had the unfortunate experience. These 3 great marine reptiles are far from the only ones to roam the seas. In fact, this is why chondrichthyans have gradually lost their place in the ocean, although they have not disappeared. In another genre, I'd like to introduce you to Placodus, a sauropside that belongs to the Placodont family. Placodonts are marine diapsids whose bodies are protected by a carapace of enlarged ribs. In some species, these enlarged ribs are even fused together. Placodonts belong to the groups that flourished in the Triassic period. They diversified extensively during this period. Placodus is quite different, as you can see, from our long-necked reptiles. Measuring 2 meters or 7 feet long on average, it is rather stocky and has a relatively short neck and legs. Placodus is equally at home in the water and on land. He's not very fast, but he does pretty well and is far from lagging behind when prey presents itself. Speaking of prey, Placodus is particularly fond of mollusks and crustaceans. Its teeth are devilishly efficient, a veritable shell crusher. In fact, its large cobblestone-shaped teeth crush the shellfish it plucks from the seabed or rocks, thanks to the flattened teeth at the front of its jaws. Nothing can resist it. Now let's take a look at another marine reptile. You can't leave the ocean without admiring the famous Plesiosaurus, undoubtedly one of the most emblematic reptiles of the Triassic period. Recognizable by its barrel-shaped body, swimming legs, long neck, and small tail, the plesiosaur fascinates fans of prehistoric Mesozoic animals. This group of marine reptiles is very popular, and no doubt fueled the legend of the Loch Ness Monster. He is also known for his epic battles with ichthyosaurs, if the breathless literary works of the 19th century are to be believed. When he wasn't fighting to preserve his place and preserve his hunting territory, he was attacking schools of fish, his favorite delicacy. Its long, perfectly flexible neck enabled it to cross schools of fish. To capture its prey, it used its long, sharp teeth. Let's continue with another ichthyosaur. This time it's a Myxosaurus. It's one of the smallest marine reptiles we've seen so far. It measures around 1 meter or 3 feet and weighs just 20 kilograms or 45 pounds. Its dolphin-like, slight-arched body is equipped with a dorsal fin, pectoral fins, and a pseudocaudal fin. Despite having longer front flippers than rear ones, it seems that our ichthyosaur was rather slow. But that didn't stop it from teasing fish when it was hungry. Its many sharp teeth testify to its predatory abilities. Myxosaurus has much in common with other ichthyosaurs. First of all, they are all reptiles that have returned to the aquatic environment and no longer have any connection with dry land. In fact, they give birth to their young in the open sea. Secondly, they too had to come to the surface to breathe. And yes, contrary to popular belief, they do have lungs, not gills. So here's what we can say about marine reptiles. As we have seen here, a far from exhaustive list of the members of this group. As well as being very diverse, they are also very present, especially in the tethys, but also very numerous. Their sheer numbers and tremendous radiation no doubt have their origins in the rising waters of the Triassic period. As we saw earlier, the Hercynian chain occupies a strategic position on the continent of Pangaea. But there's a small detail that we haven't mentioned yet, but which is of major importance here. On the western flank, a rift was created between the mountain range and the tethys. Since then, the Earth's activity and the movement of tectonic plates have caused this fault to widen more and more. Water infiltrates and gradually covers part of the land along the fault. As the water advances, the fault will eventually fracture completely, splitting the continent in two, with the opening of the North Atlantic Ocean. But let's get back to our subject, marine reptiles. This rise in water level is beneficial to them. They are taking advantage of the windfall and expanding their territory. They fill in the gap and settle along the coastline. Food is plentiful, and there are no real predators competing with them. All the lights are on to occupy new ecological niches. They thrive, but they also evolve rapidly. This is why this extraordinary group of animals is said to be undergoing a major radiation phenomenon. If there are so many predators, it's because prey are also present. The fish we're about to see are undoubtedly part of the menu of one of these reptiles. Perlitus, for example, is an actinopterygian fish. Actinopterygians are bony fish whose fins are supported by rays. It measures around 15 centimeters or 6 inches. Alongside Perlitus, another actinopterygian fish can be found in the water column, Opabinia. The shape is a little different and it is slightly longer, around 20 centimeters or 8 inches. These fish are found alongside another kind of aquatic animal. Encrinus is in fact a crinoid. Crinoids are echinoderms such as the sea star or sea urchin. Without leaving the aquatic world altogether, but swapping the marine world for banks and marshes, we can also encounter large amphibians, just as fearsome and feared as our previous marine reptiles within their own ecosystem. The banks and coasts, like the marshes, benefit from lush plant cover. They therefore abound in insects and small prey of all kinds that can satisfy the appetite of our amphibians. Meet Stenatosaurus, a labyrinthodont amphibian. Labyrinthodonts are large salamander-like amphibians. Some of them were giant salamanders, though, as Stenatosaurus could well have measured between 2.5 and 3.5 meters, or up to 12 feet. Their name, labyrinthodont, comes from the shape of their tooth enamel. The contact surfaces of the teeth form a kind of labyrinth. Today, an animal of this size would be very impressive and particularly frightening, despite its gentle salamander-like appearance. In the Triassic period, it appreciated marshy environments and undoubtedly hunted small fish. Despite its incredible adaptability, it will have a hard time competing with the arrival of crocodiles in the near future. What do you say we leave the wetlands behind and head a little further inland to discover the wildlife that inhabits the continent? As we mentioned in the introduction, for Triassic fauna, the first act of the period was rather difficult to get through. The stigmata of the Great Crisis are still very present, and it is initially the species that survive the crisis that populate Pangaea. These survivors included archosauromorphs such as the Rosocians and Sarasuchus in particular. It wasn't until the Middle Triassic period that the evolution of these archosauromorphs became truly significant, as the future archosaurians gave rise to pterosaurs, crocodiles, and dinosaurs, making up a large part of the Mesozoic animal population. As we have seen, at the very end of the Permian, a few reptiles tried their hand at flight, or rather gliding through the air. Initially, they flew only short distances, enabling them to move from tree to tree without risking their lives on the ground. Predators are numerous and dangerous at the foot of trees. However, these reptiles also benefit from radiation and are able to compensate for this apparent danger. This radiation, or speciation, whichever term you prefer, enables some species to occupy new ecological niches and adapt to different environmental conditions. Here, it's the numerous predators on the ground that require adaptation. At the same time, insects have flourished, particularly in the upper part of the forest, the canopy. These insects form a new food reserve, and thus an ecological niche that is currently unoccupied or only marginally occupied. These new reptiles of the sky will find both protection and a source of food in flight. Archosaurs gave rise to a new lineage, the pterosaurs, the famous flying reptiles. No, they're not dinosaurs. Pterosaurs are indeed reptiles, but they have large wings made up of several membranes. One is attached to the fourth finger of their forelegs, another is between the wrist and the trunk, and the third is attached from the thigh to the tail. The first and last are not always perceptible, depending on the representations imagined by the artists. In some species, however, these small membranes are clearly visible. The largest, which forms the wing proper, is very distinctive. Among the pterosaurs, we can admire the flight of Eudimorphodon and Priondactylus, the very first sky gods. In fact, here we're no longer dealing with a gliding mode of travel, but rather with the beating of wings. That's why we're talking about flying reptiles, not gliders. In the Triassic, there were three main families of pterosaurs: Campylognathodidae, Anurognathidae, and Dimorphodontidae. Eudimorphodon is the oldest known to date and belongs to the Campylognathodidae. It seems that this family did not continue its evolutionary process after the Triassic period. By contrast, the Anurognathidae and Dimorphodontidae families continue to thrive and evolve. The most primitive species would be Priondactylus. We can see, for example, that its legs and even its wings are relatively short. Others, such as Rhamphorhynchus, appear to be more advanced. At least their speciation seems more obvious. The teeth of these pterosaurs are more differentiated. Rhamphorhynchus means jaw beak. It's easy to see why, given the length of their teeth. In addition to their size, they are also sharp and curved forward. A very useful set of teeth when it comes to harpooning its prey in flight. The Dimorphodontidae family includes the Dimorphodon genus and the Petanosaurus genus, which means winged lizard. According to scientists, as pterosaurs evolved, two main subgroups emerged: the long-tailed Rhamphorhynchoids and the pterodactyloids. The Rhamphorhynchoids are the first to arrive, along with Eudimorphodon and Petanosaurus, which we saw earlier. Among the oldest known pterosaurs is Ostriodactylus. It belongs to the Campylognathodidae family. Ostriodactylus has an estimated wingspan of around 1.2 meters or 4 feet. That may sound impressive, but compared with future pterosaurs such as Quetzalcoatlus, an animal weighing almost 250 kilograms or 550 pounds, and with an 11-meter or 36-foot wingspan, it looks pretty small. The Middle Triassic was a rather flourishing period for both marine and terrestrial fauna and flora. However, the transition from the Middle Triassic to the Upper Triassic was not a smooth one. A mini-crisis, so to speak, gradually set in. Many species declined, while others took advantage of the gap to move into these new ecological niches. We saw the rise in water levels a few minutes ago during the Middle Triassic. This time, the level is gradually dropping, bringing with it its share of consequences, dramatic for some and beneficial for others. Scientists are not yet in a position to assert anything, as they unfortunately lack sufficient data on the subject. However, and this is of course conditional, it could be that the hypothesis of the regression of the ocean is at the origin, or at least one of the possible reasons among others, for this crisis during the Triassic period. If this were true, it could be that the shrinking of the epicontinental zone, by which we mean a sea bordering the continental shelf, would have upset the established order of coastal-dependent animals. This hypothesis is supported by the fact that pelagic animals, i.e., those that swim or float on the high seas, suffered very few negative consequences from this regression of the waters. They have probably simply expanded their territory, Those that depended on the coast, on the other hand, are finding it extremely difficult to survive. Only coastal animals such as Nothosaurus have been fully affected by this change in environment. In marine reptiles, the established order was totally reshaped. These predominantly coastal animals are gradually being replaced by pelagic animals, i.e., those that take advantage of the open sea and the water column. Coastal marine reptiles are not the only ones to suffer the consequences of this microcrisis. Chondrichthyans were also severely affected by the intermediate crisis that weakened the transition from the Middle Triassic to the Upper Triassic. Many of them are benthic animals. As the waters receded, the lack of oxygen made it difficult for these species to acclimatize to deeper or more remote areas. Lack of food and anoxia will be the death knell for these species. All of them? Not quite. Remember, when we talked about chondrichthyans, we saw that a small handful of them had, unlike the others, finally found shelter in the deep sea. So they came through the crisis with flying colors. However, before they could go a little further to the surface, as their ancestors did at the time, it would take a long, slow evolution of almost 35 million years. Hybodonts, for example, are among the chondrichthyans that adapted perfectly to the waters of the Triassic period. They lived through these 50 million years, enjoying the oceans, yes, but with fear in their stomachs. They lived in the same geographical zone as the imposing marine reptile, Liapleurodon, for example, which could measure up to 7 meters or 23 feet. Hybodonts, far from being alpha predators at the top of the food chain, were the prey of large marine reptiles. The late Triassic also saw the appearance of so-called modern sharks. The main difference between the so-called primitive sharks and the more evolved ones is their backbone. Do you remember the swimming style of the chondrichthyans we've met so far? No? Then let me refresh your memory a little. Most of them had what we call an undulating stroke. It's still quite effective, but it's far from being very efficient. Now, do you know why these animals swam this way? Contrary to what you might imagine, it had nothing to do with their fins. In fact, it's the spine, and more specifically, the structure of the spine itself that's the key. Their spine is cartilaginous, and therefore very flexible. The undulatory mode is therefore ultimately the only possibility. Modern sharks, on the other hand, have a calcified spine and are therefore much more rigid. Swimming is much more efficient, and above all faster, as they can propel themselves and better manage their trajectory. These sharks will therefore be able to adapt and conquer new marine territories. To conclude the subject of species in decline and those benefiting from radiation, let's talk about ichthyosaurs. Ichthyosaurs are undoubtedly the ones that are doing best in the end. We met some of these species earlier. They manage to make the most of the deep sea, and are, for the time being at least, safe from harm. This group is growing and diversifying. First appearing millions of years ago, they crossed the Jurassic and even the Cretaceous. They were thus present throughout the Mesozoic. Quite a feat when you consider how many upheavals and crises there were. In addition to rising sea levels and the complications faced by marine species, the arrival of the Upper Triassic heralded drastic climatic changes. If a fragile equilibrium seemed to have been achieved during the Middle Triassic, It is now beginning to fracture. In the late Triassic, Pangaea fragmented a little further, and intense volcanic activity in areas such as Morocco and New England signaled the beginning of the opening of the North Atlantic. The average global temperature is 18 degrees Celsius, or 64.4 degrees Fahrenheit. It was 17 degrees Celsius, or 62.6 degrees Fahrenheit, at the beginning of the Triassic period. Terrestrial activity, particularly plate movement, brings with it many geological, climatic, and therefore biological changes. But this doesn't prevent certain species from continuing their gentle evolution, almost serenely. The Mesozoic is a fascinating period. From an early age, children are fascinated by the animals of this period. Dinosaurs are as captivating as they are frightening. Animals 1,000 miles from those we know today, inconceivable in our own time, of such extraordinary sizes and morphologies that they seem to have sprung straight from our imagination. And yet, they're very real, and even walked the earth before us humans. It's these emblematic animals of the Mesozoic era that have made it so popular with the general public. Their story begins in the Middle Triassic, but it's mainly in the Upper Triassic that a spectacular diversification takes place, to make a striking entrance on the Jurassic scene a few thousand years later. Let's go back to their beginnings to understand their evolutionary process. In the animal world of the late Paleozoic and early Mesozoic, amphibians and mammalian reptiles gradually gave way to diapsid reptiles. Among the latter, as we have seen, archosaurs underwent significant adaptive radiation. They gave rise to groups that disappeared at the end of the Triassic, such as the phytosaurs, attosaurs, and the Rosocians, as well as the crocodiles and the pterosaurs that we recently left behind. But the ones we remember most are undoubtedly the dinosaurs. Their history begins with the dinosauromorphs. Lagosuchus, Merosuchus, and Lagarpeton are all reptiles with the potential to start the dinosaur line. Lagosuchus is a lightly built archosaur, remarkable for its long, slender legs and well-developed foot. Here we see the characteristics of the first dinosaurs taking shape. It is, however, much smaller than its descendants. It measures just 40 centimeters or 16 inches in length, and weighs just 100 to 200 grams. Its name means crocodile rabbit. This name perfectly defines its physical attributes and abilities. Carnivorous, it preys on small prey, such as lizards, but is also fond of insects. Although it moves around on all fours most of the time, it can also rise easily on its hind legs and even run. It is therefore an agile predator, able to use its speed to hunt prey and escape from larger predators. Let's take a look at Merosuchus. Clearly a member of the dinosauromorph clade. He doesn't yet have a hole in his skull, between the eye socket and nostrils, behind each eye socket, or the famous hole in the hip socket. It does, however, have an elongated pubis and the trochanters, a kind of protrusion, on the anterior femur, characteristic of dinosaurs. Research and studies are still going on today to get closer every day to reality, and above all, to the truth about the history of our planet and its past inhabitants. According to recent studies, other species such as Silosaurus are probably even closer to the first dinosaurs than Marasuchus. With the passage of time, it's always difficult to be definitive about such ancient origins. Speaking of Silosaurus, a rather astonishing anecdote was revealed in a 2018 article in the journal Historical Biology. It seems that paleontologists were able to demonstrate through the study of its skeleton that juveniles begged for food in the manner of fledglings with their heads raised and mouths wide open. This is a nod to our modern birds, which we might describe as avian dinosaurs. Now let's take a look at the final member of our dinosauromorph trio, Largerpeton. Measuring 70 centimeters or 28 inches long, his body is built for running. It has elongated hind legs and a highly developed tibia. There are also some similarities with early dinosaurs, or at least characteristics that could have given rise to the dinosaur lineage. One of Largerpeton's astonishing abilities, based on the study of its toes on the hind legs, is that it was undoubtedly a jumping animal, or at least capable of this little feat. Knowing that it was certainly an insectivore, this type of ability would indeed have been an asset when hunting insects. So that's what we can say about the first dinosauromorphs. If we follow the thread of our history and the evolutionary processes of these different species, we can see that things were moving very fast in the animal world at this time. While the first dinosauromorphs were developing, pterosaurs occupied the skies and marine reptiles invaded the oceans. Over thousands of years on land, territories were divided between dinosaurs and crocodilians, and at first the dinosaurs clearly had the advantage. They developed faster and more extensively than the crocodilomorphs. Dinosaurs were able to radiate so rapidly because they easily counter crocodiles and seem better adapted to their environment. First of all, they are bipedal predators with vertical limbs. Unlike crocodiles, which are quadrupeds with lateral limbs, they are much livelier, and above all more mobile when hunting prey or even fleeing a larger predator. Secondly, contrary to popular belief, dinosaurs appear to be warm-blooded. This metabolism allowed for a more active lifestyle. The rest of history, however, ultimately favored crocodilians, which are still with us today, while non-avian dinosaurs died out at the end of the Cretaceous. We'll come back to the subject of crocodiles a little later in our video, but for now let's return to the subject that interests us here, the Triassic and the birth of the dinosaurs. Their rise, development, and in particular their diversification were very rapid. As early as the Triassic period, just a few million years after their appearance, we can already see the appearance of the two great lineages that will define the classification of this great family of dinosaurs. The latter gave rise to the theropods, which include the large carnivores but also birds. To understand what characterizes and differentiates these two groups, we need to look at their skeletons. Saurischian means lizard hip, while ornithischian means bird hip. The pelvises of both, as shown here, are quite distinct. Saurischians are therefore dinosaurs with a pubis facing forwards, unlike ornithischians, whose pubis faces backwards. Paradoxical as it may seem, it was not the ornithischians, the bird hips, that gave rise to the avian dinosaur clades. Birds, in fact, originated from lizard hips, the saurischians. Now that we know a little about the two great dinosaur lineages, it's time to meet our first specimens of the genus. This small Upper Triassic tetrapod dinosaur is 222 million years old. It's true that when you think of the extraordinary sizes that later Mesozoic species would sport, it's hard to imagine that this little being of just 1 meter, or 3 feet long, 30 centimeters, or 12 inches high, and between 1 and 5 kilograms, was part of this extraordinary family. And yet, it's one of the very few dinosaurs the Earth has ever known. Bipedal, it has long hind legs but short arms. It has large clawed hands, a long slender snout, and a tail. Don't be fooled by its name, which means elegant jaw. It has many small teeth, and judging by its teeth, is a carnivore. It feeds on insects, lizards, and other small prey. It can also be a scavenger. This little dinosaur prefers marshy areas. It has established its territory in this vast area where food is abundant, and thanks to its mobility, it can easily conquer an ecological niche that can still be exploited by new predators. Let's take a look at another old dinosaur, so to speak, with the study of platosaurs. From the Upper Triassic onwards, dinosaurs began to reach impressive sizes. With the genus Plateosaurus, we're a long way from being able to maintain the appellation small dinosaur in our description. Estimates put its average length at 8 meters or 26 feet. It weighs around 4 tons. With its thick, robust bones, this is a rather massive dinosaur. Skeletal studies show that this type of dinosaur could move around on all fours, but could also stand up on its hind legs if necessary. They are robust but also very powerful. Why were they so powerful? No doubt to feed on the leaves and the trees. Yes, our gentle mastodon is not a carnivore, but a herbivore. Its serrated teeth enable it to crush the leaves it eats. To help with his digestive process, he also swallows stones, gastroliths, to better crush the food in his stomach. Another dinosaur, this time a carnivore, lived in what is now South America. This was Herrerasaurus. Herrerasaurus occupies a fairly large territory in valleys, where a river meanders through the middle of the land. This precious commodity attracts many animals looking for water, and therefore potential prey. It measures just over 3 meters or 10 feet long on average, and weighs between 200 and 300 kilograms, or between 440 pounds and 600 pounds. If he's not so heavy for such a respectable length, it's because his bones are long and hollow. At the time, it was undoubtedly the largest terrestrial carnivore. It attacked almost all the vertebrates in its ecosystem, including rhynchosaurs, diconodonts, and ettosaurs. A biped, it had powerful hind legs, short thighs, and long feet. This type of silhouette suggests that it was probably a good runner. It also has short arms equipped with sharp claws for lacerating prey and tearing flesh. Its sharp, curved, razor-sharp teeth were perfect for killing its victims. Thanks to its articulated jaw, once the prey is seized, it can hold it firmly in its mouth. Our Herrerasaurus shares its territory with other predators, notably a crocodile-like quadruped like Sarasuchus, Its legs are not on its sides but under its belly. This makes for more skillful movement. It averages 7 meters or 23 feet in length and is a feared carnivore in the valley. Its teeth are large, curved, and serrated, making for a good grip and deadly damage. Let's take advantage of the discovery of this Saurosuchus to talk about the crocodilomorphs, which we have so far neglected in favor of dinosaurs. Crocodilomorphs appeared around the same time as dinosaurs. While the latter underwent a meteoric rise in radiation, the crocodilomorphs are still very important. Crocodilomorphs diversified extensively, starting in the Triassic period. However, not all crocodilomorphs took the form we recognize today. The first crocodilomorphs, undoubtedly the Sphenosuchians, look more like ferocious greyhounds than crocodilians in the strict sense. Small in stature, they are slender and slender. The fact that they are quadrupeds with their hind legs longer than their front ones gives them a slightly arched, slightly built appearance. In addition to their modest size, the first crocodilomorphs were also rather active, compared with the way today's crocodiles look. While some species will find it difficult to adapt to the various changes that will take place on Earth over the coming thousands of years, other, slow-growing crocodilomorphs will make it through the ages. Even today, this characteristic still defines crocodiles, which take several years to reach their final size. Let's close this crocodilian parenthesis and return to our famous dinosaurs. Among the oldest of them, we can also mention the Euraptor, as well as being one of the oldest. The Euraptor is also one of the smallest. It measures just 40 centimeters or 16 inches high, and is about 1 meter or 3 feet long. According to skeletal analysis, the Euraptor was a small, skillful carnivore. Its long legs enabled it to run fast in pursuit of small prey such as lizards. At the end of its long neck, its slender skull housed an army of small, sharp teeth. Another popular Triassic dinosaur was Colophysis. Rather slender and agile, this carnivore measured up to 3 meters or 10 feet in length, for an average of 30 kilograms or 66 pounds. It is therefore rather slender. Using its curved, crenulated teeth, it hunted fish and insects. Paleontologists have unearthed numerous fossils of this species, notably in Arizona and New Mexico. The study of these fossils has revealed a number of clues as to how these dinosaurs lived. Firstly, they probably lived in groups. There are 2 advantages to living in a herd. Group hunting is often more fruitful, and group protection is facilitated by numbers. However, despite the emergence of new clades and extraordinary lineages, despite the ability of certain species to adapt to a complex environment, despite the apparent calm and exponential diversification, once again the world is heading for chaos. The Triassic remains the only period in geological history framed by 2 major crises. While the beginning of the Triassic was built on the ashes of the Permian, the end of the Triassic did not have a more glorious ending, with a major new crisis that would constitute a real fracture between the Triassic and the Jurassic to come. At the end of the Triassic, there was intense volcanic activity, and let's not forget that the Atlantic Ocean was opening up. A few small pieces of land appeared with this lowering of the water level. This newly hatched archipelago was the birthplace of the future Europe. Volcanic eruptions are numerous and intense, releasing massive quantities of gas and dust. The Earth continues to heat up. Another fracture, other than that of the Hercynian chain into which the Tethys rushes, takes shape at the ridge that links western Gondwana to eastern Gondwana. In addition, several medium-sized asteroids will strike the Earth. Impact craters, such as the Manicouagan crater in Labrador, with a diameter of 100 kilometers or 62 miles, bear witness to this. A climatic and geological upheaval was all it took for a biological upheaval to sweep the Earth once again. The pre-established order is shattered. Nature will once again need perseverance, tactics, and courage to rise from the ashes. But that's for another story.